books are interesting. Some aren't. Often I dog-ear the pages of books that I'm reading if I find a line or something, that I'd like to remember that I think is important. And, I have some books on my shelves that pages are dog-eared double because there was a really amazing thought on one page and there was a really amazing thought on the other page, the facing page. And so the whole damn thing is just nothing but dog ears. And then there's other books where there's zero. When I read Nietzsche, for example, there was lots of dog ears on Beyond Good and Evil, which is a great book. And Nietzsche actually, he came up with the most arrogant statement anybody ever made about himself as an author, which is really quite impressive to come up with the most arrogant statement. That's really something. And he was great at coming up with one-liners, philosophical one-liners. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to write. And then he said, that they can't even write in a book. So that's pretty good, eh?
Well,
sure, it's great.
Awesome. So I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and by a very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And today by a man who could write in one sentence what other people surely need at least half a paragraph or something.
At least.
Other people would need a whole podcast to write what he could write in one sentence.
He could do in one sound drop what other people need a whole podcast to say.
Exactly.
All the sound drops now are just not safe for other people's shows. Or this one. I think this one is safe.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers does not like you.
Yeah. There you go. That's safe.
So usually when the show starts late, there's we were doing, we were uploading graphics, or I was hitting a lot of traffic on my way to the studio. I'm obviously not in the studio right now. It's brutal outside. I could barely get it together to take my dog out to pee. It's raining so bad. Not tonight. Tonight, Jason was just saying funny shit, and I wanted to listen to it. So that's the only reason we're late right now, literally.
Just gossip. Yeah, just dudes gossiping.
Yeah. Well, Jason is a dude who also has a piece that is about to come out in Sublation magazine.
Yes.
Called Same as It Ever Was.
Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
If there was a way to dog ear a website, just all over the
place. Same as it ever was. Yeah, same as it ever was. I love using music as titles for the pieces, but you actually helped me quite a bit with this piece. It's the illusion of political discourse in America, kind of, how we view the discourse. I definitely use this piece to talk a lot about immigration and tough on crime statistics. I think people that watch shows like this kind of have a feeling on what really happened with the defund moment. But even I was shocked to learn some of the facts when I dug a little deeper about the increase that several police departments had.
Yeah, nobody actually defunded anything. There was everybody kind of talked about a lot and got it out of their system, and then within a year or two, everything was increasing.
Large increases. There's a lot. There was and also I didn't know how much talk there was about it, and how many times we saw the image of the murder of George Floyd. I think it was over 1 billion times by 2 months in.
Yeah.
That image kept replaying. And so for a while, news media was all about police misconduct.
Yeah. And of course, now, as you point out, there's been a lot about retail crime, and also the other big focus of that part of the article. There has been tons about immigration and the crisis on the border, which I want to get into with you. by talking about a couple of articles that I didn't like nearly as much as I liked yours. These would have,
That's good. Thanks.
these would have like 0 dog ears if I was printing them out and dog earing the. I don't know exactly how that would work or why, but what the context. The reason, I mean, you wrote the article a little bit earlier, but the sort of immediate context for this is been that there's been all of this buzz about this border bill, which people hate for kind of diametrically opposite reasons. That people who want a more humane immigration system hate it because this is actually like to the right of Trump in many ways, and then the actual GOP immigration hysterics all hate it because it doesn't go far enough, and really because they don't want to take the issue off the table, so they can run on it right in the fall. And so in that context, so I saw two things today that I did just want to address, and I wanted to get your thoughts on, because I think that they can because one of the big things I got out of this first one especially was just how fucking short people's memories are politically.
Oof.
This first one is from I am going to Batya Ungar Sargon. I don't know if she's related to the Akkad Sargons or not, but but she's the opinion editor at Newsweek, and this segment is probably going to foreclose any possibility they'll ever write for Newsweek, but that's fine.
Stranger things have happened.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the Compact Teamsters in the graphics. And it's called "Why Rank and File Teamsters Love Trump." I should say that I see actually very little evidence in this article that rank and file Teamsters do love Trump, but that's almost beside the point. The actual context is Trump meeting with the head of the Teamsters Union, which is not necessarily that significant in its own way. Maybe it's a little bit of a fuck you to Biden that they even took the meeting, but they're certainly not looking like they're going to endorse Trump or anything. And in fact, they ended up having this argument about immigration. And in the article, Sargon ends up, she says, she talks about, all these working class people, she says, voted for Trump in 2016. Some of them she thinks are Teamsters. She doesn't really have a lot of evidence for that. And she says, this is a bitter pill for the Democrats to swallow, and they have found many creative ways around admitting that they're catering to the elites rather than the working class. Fine, right? One classic version derives from Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which argued that the white working class had been bamboozled by conservative media to fixate on culture wars and vote against its economic interests. Not even what I want to talk about, but I do want to note in passing she didn't read that book, since the actual argument that Frank makes is that it's because Democrats weren't meaningfully representing those interests either, right, that the cultural issues ended up predominating. But she goes on to say, but far from emphasizing culture over economics, Trump's 2016 campaign broke with longstanding GOP orthodoxies in ways that were tailor-made to cater to the working class. There's no better example of this than immigration. Liberal elites love to talk about immigration in moral terms, lambasting anyone who doesn't support open borders as being racist or heartless. But this moral vanity hides a deeper truth. The urban professional class benefits economically from mass illegal immigration, as the consumers of low-wage labor think of the nannies they employ, the takeout food they order. She goes on in this vein. And she says, this is my favorite line. This is what I want to read to you. She says, back when they were the party of the working class. That's how the sentence opens. Does anybody want to guess when this time was? When the Democrats?
The 60s.
That would make sense. I mean, the 60s is when Medicare, was passed, for example. Some of the most significant redistributive reforms in American history. Yeah, that'd be a really solid guess. Anyone else?
The FDR era.
Oh my God. Really good guess too, right? Like that would make so much sense. It could be the 30s when we were getting
70s would
Social
be like
Security.
the most. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. You're
That would
saying
be horrible. She said the 70s, but I mean,
that would be when it switched, right? When it really,
Okay,
really,
well,
really,
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's definitely when the
it's the
neoliberal,
neoliberal turn is a Volcker shock. Yeah.
yeah, Carter, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, these were all guesses that you would make if you knew anything about American politics.
Sure.
The way the sentence ends, well, here, let me start it over from the beginning.
Jesus Christ.
Yes,
Back
please.
when they were the party of the working class, Democrats opposed mass illegal immigration. Consider the late Representative Barbara Jordan, a liberal icon who in the 1990s led a commission that called for curtailing migration. So, to be clear, Batya Ungar Sargon, opinion editor for Newsweek, thinks that the time when the Democrats were the party of the working class was the 1990s.
Well, Newsweek, I have this to say to you.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers is not like you.
I actually know if you want a countering opinion, just for the sake of like an ombudsman, we have a little podcast host that could write an op-ed about when the actual the last time the Democrats were the party of the working classes, right? I mean, if the 90s Democrats were the party of the working class, there's really very little meaningful difference between then and now, right?
I mean, look,
NAFTA?
it is, yeah, right. I mean, in a certain sense, I think the right answer is, was Democrats part of the working class is like never, right? But even if we're going to play that game and say, okay, I kind of know what you mean, right? I'm not going to be like an annoying, commie about this. I'll just like give you your framing. But even if we are going to play that game, look, yeah, I mean, again, you guys' guesses, the 30s, the 60s, those made sense. The 1990s is the time when NAFTA happened. The 1990s is the time when welfare reform happened, which, my God, if you want to talk about cheap labor, like taking like single mothers who'd given birth a few weeks before and making them go work in these like dirty and dangerous jobs at like Tyson Foods, taking apart the chickens that, so they didn't get their benefits completely lost. That's, like that's the kind of thing that was going on in the 90s.
Massive financial deregulation starts to happen in the 90s as well.
Oh my God, Glass-Steagall.
You start about 94, and by the time you get to 99, it's fully gone. But also you start to have, I guess I can see where someone like that is trying to come from, because when you think about the 90s, if you're of a certain age, you probably remember easy access to credit in a way that you don't even have access to now unless you actually have a good credit score. And people being able to buy homes with credit scores nowadays that, can't even get you a car loan. Also, we're talking about the days of no income verification loans as well. And a lot of this starts to happen in the 90s and, of course, really ramps up on a hyper speed in the 2000s with the Bush administration. So if you're talking about the growth of what we would probably call, people that watch this show, the petite bourgeoisie, yes, it actually happens in spades in the 90s. You actually have a lot of people, poor working class people, that if they didn't own a home, they probably bought their first home around that time. And if they did own a home, they saw so much growth with equity, because we have to keep in mind home prices kind of mirrored about what you were making in the early 90s, and interest rates were extremely high. There was some inflation in the early 90s in the first, or the kind of the tail end of the Bush era. So if your point is you could, you bought your house for $25,000 in 1992 or even in the 80s,
sure,
and now it's 1999 and that house is worth 200,000-300,000 depending on where you live. I'm California native, so I saw those massive jumps, and a lot of businesses were started at this time. But unlike I think what makes this time interesting to me that I haven't really seen too many people talk about is there is this massive jump for people. Take me, for example, that goes from kind of poor, I'm not really going to get too far, and I start making hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight.
Ugh.
And then the market crashes, and then I'm back to reality. And it stays in reality. It's not changing for me. And there's tons of people that it didn't change for. And this fallout we're still seeing the fallout from 2008. And I think we look at it because it's so far back. But when you see these large encampments and you're seeing so many elderly people that don't have anything and lost their homes, and in the shelter I worked at, I dealt with people that lost their homes during the 2008 crisis. So that's a real weird, extremely short-sighted way to even try to understand the financial instability of the 90s that leads to where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, like, to put a finer point on it, I mean, sure, I definitely, there are lots of things that have gotten worse for ordinary people since the 90s, and for people trying to climb certain kinds of ladders since the 90s. But a lot of those things are downstream of things that happened in the 90s, right? You just mentioned the crash, right? I mean, as we said earlier, the financial deregulation, right, happened in the 90s. That was Bill Clinton, champion of the working class, I guess.
Jesus Christ.
And in fact, the most important liberalization of the immigration system in in modern history, right, is 1965, when they took out the national origin quotas that made it very difficult for people who weren't from basically like Britain and Northern Europe and places like that to immigrate to the U.S. And that was LBJ, right? So in fact, in the 90s, she mentions Barbara Jordan because she can call her a liberal icon, but Bill Clinton signed, and like not reluctantly, a immigration act, kind of in between the crime bill and the effective death penalty and anti-terrorism act, when he was on a roll, that essentially created, the deportation machine that was, used so much in the 2000s, right? Under really Obama and Trump, is when it ramped up the most. So like the kind of narrative here about like, oh, see, Democrats like immigration now more than they used to because they're more neoliberal and they want the cheap labor. It's like, no, if anything, the Democratic Party, I mean, like the 90s were really the time of the all-out, unabashed embrace of neoliberalism. I mean, Bill Clinton kept talking about how he was a new kind of Democrat, and he wasn't, the era of big government is over, all that shit. The Biden era is, if anything, it's, I mean, I would argue that it's not very different in its fundamentals, but I mean, like it's certainly marked a softening of that and a little bit of a, ideological blurring of the lines, compared to the 1990s, right? So I think that I think the narrative here just doesn't work at all. And if you look at the other one, the Howley compact one, this is the Border Bills Assault on American Workers by Josh Howley.
Awesome.
Senator Josh Howley, and I will, about which, again, it's the same argument, essentially, cheap labor, and about which all I would have to say is what I said to Sohrab Ahmari when he was on the show, and he said he was going to do this event with Josh Howley, and I said, ask him why he doesn't, why he's not a co-sponsor of the PRO Act, right? I mean, like he cares so much about wages, right? Why doesn't he want to make it easier to organize a union? That seems like it would be, a much more direct way of solving the problem than like rounding up and deporting a bunch of people just kind of trying to live and hoping that downstream of that there were some, knock-on effects where they were better for some people's wages. And, I've got to say, I don't know if you asked him or not, but I actually wrote an article back at the end of 2021. I think I was I think I remember editing it in a hotel room somewhere in Texas while I was actually on. That was the night that I was in a hotel room on my big trip to the West Coast when I was on TIR.
Oh shit, yeah.
So that's the Nation article there. It's called 2.5 cheers for Comrade Josh Howley, and it was the argument in the article is essentially the same. It was like when Howley was making pro-labor noises about Biden stopping the rail strike, is like, okay, sure, great, I agree, but I'm so confused about why he's not co-sponsoring the PRO Act, why he's not supporting $15 minimum wage, et cetera, like, since these are things that would all actually make sense if the cheap labor thing was your major concern about immigration, as opposed to, I think, and I'll definitely have you back on for a deeper dive into this, right? After the article comes out. But I mean, just, a lot of what you're talking about in the article, I think, what I got out of it is, that there is, that the function that like the constant fear mongering about the border plays politically, much like some of the crime stuff you're talking about elsewhere in the article. I mean, it's a thing to it's a thing to whip people up about. It's a thing to get eyeballs on news broadcasts. It's a thing to to keep people in a state of agitation. Yeah. But ultimately it's like the thing that right wingers do, the meme where they talk about the current thing, right? It's like whatever the libs are hyper focused on at the moment. It's like, yeah, some truth there, but also like what, you guys don't have your current thing?
Their current thing is winning right now. I mean, I in the article I say, it's kind of the statement is wins that the Democratic Party had in 2020 are going to be their downfall in 2024. So, kind of a support of BLM and a tepid support of BLM made them kind of the face for the defund movement, even though they were not. And I said it publicly. It doesn't matter, right?
They didn't say defund, and and like when they were asked, they'd be like, "Oh no, I don't support."
Yeah,
that.
they would always be like, "No."
But at the same time, though, just to bolster your point, they were like, they would all say all the ritual hashtags and like just the right way at just the right time, right? I think
kneeling with the kente cloth.
Oh my God, every few months I remember that happened. That all of those people.
It's not AI. No,
exactly.
That really was a thing that happened.
Exactly. And like, Elizabeth Warren, like her DNC speech in 2020, there were like some children's blocks in the background that spelled out Black Lives Matter.
the NFL changes and they want to have all this BLM stuff, and kneeling no longer is an offense to the presidential office. So, which is also kind of bullshit to me. But that and immigration reform became, if you think about what Trump was saying about murderers and rapists, and the Democratic or the liberal response, let's just say the liberal response, was to say, well, our cities are going to be safe places. And not every city really was, because there were no mandates that said that the city government is not going to work with federal law enforcement, i.e. ICE. There's a few places that literally had mandates and some major wins. Illinois as a state had some major wins in that regard, as far as truly making it a sanctuary. Cities like Chicago, definitely where I'm from, San Francisco, had some wins in that regard as well. That being said, what Trump wanted to do, and there's a Washington Post article, I think I link it in the piece. He wanted to do what Abbott and DeSantis ended up doing, which is dropping off people in these sanctuary cities en masse and being like, you deal with it. We'll just round up a bunch of people at the border and say, fucking you deal with it. Sorry for cursing. And that ends up it's what happens in Chicago. And I use Chicago as a perfect example because it ended up becoming a fight over resources amongst minority groups. So Chicago, which historically has had an interesting political machine, let's just put it that way, and a very strong black political machine, and a very strong, to a certain extent, Hispanic political machine. And you actually have an old Hispanic population that's been there for a few generations right now. And you drop off, I think it was like 29,000 refugees in a city with a brand new mayor that's trying to figure it out. You're doing a horrible job. The messaging is real bad, and you have established Latinos, and this isn't everybody, right? And black populations not wanting the quote unquote migrant caravans in their city, because you're also creating these little Hoovervilles, if you will,
Right.
because there's so many people and you don't really know what you're going to do with them. Where's the money going to go? People are fighting about the money. So I have the quote in the piece. The president of the Illinois chapter of the NAACP literally says, these people are savages, they're murderers and rapists. And you're like, what? But that's where we are in 2024. Again,
Yeah,
it wasn't that long ago.
like a clip of, I think it was Al Sharpton on MSNBC, sounding very Trumpy about the migrant stuff.
It's not it. Again, these were victories that were easy with Trump in office. And I started the piece in general because I don't know if I've said this on this show, or I sometimes I forget shows and conversations you and I have, but driving to the Bay Area where I'm from, I now live in Mexico. There's one part where my phone always dies, and it's just conservative radio.
Yeah.
It's either Jesus or conservative radio.
Yep.
And so I just listened to the conservative radio. It is like punching yourself in the nuts. I know McManus is going to be on the show. McManus is a professional nut puncher.
Yeah.
His
hand
you know,
is strong.
Let's just say props to that man for what he does. But that being said, listening to local and national conservative radio, and this is, I go up quite a bit to the Bay Area, and I listen to this stuff probably more than most. There's been a sentiment of people not really wanting Trump, which was shocking. And the push was from the hosts. So kind of the impetus for the piece, and then, kind of shifted as you write, was I felt like the need for Trump was a need from media more than people, because a lot of people don't like him.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, and I'm going to try to keep election talk down to 90 seconds because
this is gross.
Because I feel gross about it. Like we had been talking about it for a while, like last week. And I ended up it's like, what the fuck did I talk about for so long? That's like, we've got so many months of this, but yeah, like one of the striking things about this is there were all these polls in like 2022 where a big majority of people said they didn't want either Trump or Biden to run again. Yeah. And now we've got a Trump versus Biden election. It's like in both cases, I mean, none of the other Republicans could meaningfully challenge, Trump, and in the Democratic Party, they just kind of said, I mean, they essentially canceled the election for all intents and purposes. And again, nobody serious was running, and like the Iowa results aren't even going to be announced until Super Tuesday. They wanted to make really sure, that nothing happened. But it's a crazy situation, and also, like, I think going to some of what you're saying, or some of what you say in the article, at least, that I think that the way that the Democrats, like, one message is, oh, we can't have Trump again, is, I think that worked in 2020 when Trump was president, and everything was on fire, and people wanted it to stop.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot harder without Trump in office. Yeah. And especially, I mean, look, if you're, especially like, I don't know, younger voters who you want to get excited to, if it ends up being a narrower election, even aside from a lot of those people being very rightly pissed off about Gaza, is I don't know. I mean, if you lived through 4 years of Trump and you didn't like it, but also the world didn't end. And it's really hard to tell people that the world is going to end if, he gets a second term.
I think a lot of people feel that way, and people don't remember. It's weird. I think the people that remember either were there, like Charlottesville, for example. Unless you were really invested, you were there, you were part of the counter protest. Maybe you were protesting monuments in your area, these racist monuments in your area. That might mean something to you. But for the public at large, especially the way we consume media at such a rapid rate, those stories that we felt were so moving at the time are just kind of in and out of our imagination. Even going over the facts that, 1 billion times we watched collectively the murder of a man. We watched a snuff film 1 billion times. And it enraged people. There's other things that happen that get to those protests. It's not that alone, but that's, kind of the big ember right there is that murder. And there were other murders that happened in that same year leading up to that one even. And Trump's kind of reluctance to do anything about it really was a call to arms for a lot of people to have their activist moment. And him out of office outside of Gaza right now, what is people's moment to be that upset with Joe Biden? I don't say that like he's doing a good job. I'm just asking the question. Where are people really that upset? You know what I mean? To come out en masse and want to vote and make sure you get the bad man out of office. I think 4 years of Joe Biden has changed the way we view the bad man. It took 8-10 years for people to look at Bush Jr. as not a monster, and then he became a punchline in jokes. Maybe we recuperate that much quicker, and Trump is no longer a punchline, but some sort of serious person. I don't know.
Yeah,
about that.
I mean, I'm sure. Look, I could vividly remember when Bush was in office, near the end of his first term, I don't know, it's just a thing that people would say. I can remember, standing outside a bar in Miami, smoking cigarettes with my friend and this lawyer who we met at the bar, and who's actually a tobacco company lawyer. He told us, I was like, oh yeah, what kind of lawyer are you? And he holds up the cigarette. He's like, this kind. I remember that guy being like, oh yeah, being like, yeah, I'm a Republican, but Bush isn't a real Republican. He's this horrible new thing, right? And it's that was a common, that sort of essentially the equivalent of a never Trumper, but for Bush, right? That was that was a somewhat common thing. If you basically, if you were, a Republican who had a bunch of liberal friends, you might think that, right? That, and though certainly that was the way that the libs talked about Bush, that, he was this awful new thing. He was this deviation from normal politics. And, I remember, I remember Corey Robbins saying a long time ago, but I still think he's right. It might just take a little while because Trump is still too much of the game for this, that eventually, we're going to get to the point where libs say say what you want about Trump. I didn't agree with him about everything, but this new guy.
Josh Hawley.
It's the kayfabe is interesting, right? In this whole thing, because first of all, there's two people. There's only two people that we can get, and I originally thought, and I'll end with this as it's getting late, it was going to be kind of a back to normal moment. And when I say back to normal moment, I mean pre-Obama, not huge turnouts. The media coverage is kind of stuck in this world of quote unquote regular news, even more conservative news, you would say. And I just think the news machine learned so much during the Obama administration. They made so much money. And by the time Trump came along, it's just money's falling out of the sky like pennies from heaven. And DeSantis and Newsom just doesn't move the needle the same way that Donald Trump does, and he's just needed in media, and they're going to do everything in their power. I mean, anyone that was doing even what we do in 2020, and if you were doing it before that in that last election, you had huge bumps and everything. Views. We were talking about it the other day, Ben. All the views you would get in the Zero Books days.
Oh my God.
When all these right wingers or the intellectual dark web was a thing.
Oh my God. Yeah, that was the high point of the IDW. It's like, that's like, it's like, oh shit, my, my video bashing the IDW only got 20,000 views. I wonder what we did wrong. The YouTube algorithm was also a lot gentler. But yeah, right. I mean, it's like, look, there is an equivalent there. I mean, it's like that classic leaked Les Moonves statement, that Trump may be bad for the country, but he's good for CBS News.
He's good for everybody. I don't know about this world as much. I think, maybe people are worn out with it in this world. I don't know, but he really is what moves the media needle at this point. Sadly.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and this is like, look, the man, could not have done what he did the first time without just an ocean of free coverage. And, now I have absolutely no idea if he'll be able to pull it off. It's entirely possible. We're in a strange situation where both of the candidates have like crazily low approval numbers. So I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm very unpsyched about it. And I'm very grateful, I guess, as I said last time, that I live in California. So there's absolutely no reason for me to see if I can like psych myself into, pulling the lever for the lesser evil and going home and throwing up,
you just write yourself in.
Yeah, I'd write in,
How about this? I'll write you in, you write me in.
There we go. Nice. I like it. Well, and yes, I did see the comments about, how I should do the show in kente cloth. I'll do that the day we get 100,000 patrons. I'll do it. I'll do a show in kente cloth. That's, but what's going to happen sooner than that, I think, is a week from Wednesday. Jason and I are going to be at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles, California, where by then I hope it'll have stopped raining. And we did this last year. It was a lot of fun, little get together, a little meet and greet, for people who watch or listen to both shows. I think we have a graphic for it.
Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners of want. That's right. For reason in revolt now thunder. Chains of hatred, greed, and fear.
Man, I just meant the graphic, but that's awesome. The Tony Bambino International seemed like the appropriate background music for that.
Fuck yeah, Slash's booth.
But yeah, I'm gonna get that again this year. That's where we did it last year. Slash's booth. It's for anybody who's never been to the Rainbow. It is a ridiculously fun place. There's a statue of Lemmy from Motorhead in the courtyard. There's like rock iconography all over the place. There's, including the actual bodies of, people who are rock stars, 40 years ago, walking around.
Yeah. It's all those things.
It's a fun place. And look, the way I see it, if you take your significant other to this, you don't need to get them anything else for Valentine's Day. You're already done. That's surely the thing that they would most want. Is to be taken to hang out with divorced middle-aged communists.
You know what, man? I
don't even tell them where you're going until you get there.
I look.
Take off the blindfold.
we made a little compilation video. I think I did of some of the photos of that night, and just watching it, I just smiled watching it because I was like, "Oh, dude, we had so much fun, doing that." So we talked, we were going to do it again. We did it last time with less than 24 hours notice. So now people have notice. We want to see the parking lot totally full. Let's hang out, have some drinks, talk some shit. It's always a good time.
Yeah. Yes. Both of those are things I do. Make homemade bagels, also tortillas. You know, I understand the bagel thing might not be for everybody. There's like a lot of steps. It takes a while. But honestly, I kind of think if you're over the age of 25, like it's really easy to make tortillas. It takes like 10, you know, like
people
15,
are
20
really
minutes.
shocked that you make your own bagels, man. When I say that, because you came in the house one day when I was on air, you needed flour.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, come in. They're like, who are you talking to? I was like, oh, Ben he needs flour. And they're like, what's he doing? He's making bagels. I was like, Ben Burgis makes his own bagels? And Toussaint was just like, the whole thing had her like, like, what kind of bagels?
Yeah. Usually either sesame or everything. So we could answer this important question too. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my parents used to make bagels when I was growing up. I mean, it's you know, it's like I always really liked homemade bagels, but tell you what, again, much easier. And homemade tortillas are a game changer. Everything, like certainly if you're making enchiladas or something, but even if you're just having a burrito, it's like 20 times better. So you know, learn how to do that. It's like 3 ingredients.
Honestly, though, it's even better with a tortilla press.
He won't use a tortilla press. He won't use a tortilla.
Yeah, I actually, you know, I think if you're making a bunch of them all at once, the tortilla press is probably helpful. But if you're just making a few, I mean, like, I don't know, man. Like, I've never really felt much need for it. I think you just like cutting board, rolling pin, like, you know, if it doesn't, if the tortilla ends up being slightly misshapen, then like you can always just cut, you know, like the edges off or whatever. It's a very simple process. I would strongly recommend it. And yes, this is a cooking show now. We're done with politics.
Yes. Give them a recipe with Ben Burgis.
All we're gonna do.
I'm trying not to look at the chat.
I'm not even going to cook on air. I'm just going to like harangue people about how they should learn to make more things. I feel like there's an audience for that. So.
Well, I would love to see you guys. I'm sure, you know, I know Ben would love to see some more people there. Some of the guys that came last year said they're coming. Sadly, Bert Cooper of the New York Times and Atlantic fame cannot make it.
Too big time.
That's okay. We didn't need him anyway. We didn't need you, Bert.
No, he's forgotten. You know, he's forgotten the lowly podcasters he used to slum it with before he made it to the big time.
You know, that's what happens when you're, you know, New York Times and Atlantic guy now.
All right. Well, I will see. I hope some of you watching, and you can report on your progress and learning to bake various bread products. Wednesday of next week, February 14th, 6 p.m., Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles. With any we can get Slash's booth again. Very good time. Very much looking forward to it. Pleasure as always, my friend.
Andy, send me that image on the.
Yeah, we'll do. And let's put the bread in bread tube.
Thank you, guys.
Nice.
Peace.
All right. I think we're still waiting on Daniel, but let's bring on Professor Matt McManus in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is it's in Michigan, so I like that.
I'm actually in Detroit right now. I can turn it around and you can pretty much see the Renaissance Center from where I am.
How close are you
that's
to
right.
the RoboCop statue?
I forget.
I haven't seen that yet, actually. Yeah, I'm still waiting for him to fucking veer up around the corner and take out some criminals. When I see that, then I'll really feel like I live in the city.
Yeah, I forgot that you're commuting now, which is great. So I could be unabashedly enthusiastic since I don't know, man. I grew up, bleeding green and white, in East Lansing. I can remember the graffiti in my high school bathroom that said unkind things about the city of Ann Arbor. So but I'm also going to see it actually because I'm going to be in Detroit and even Ann Arbor in about a month and a half. I'm going to give a guest lecture in Matt's class, and I'm also probably going to be doing a talk for Detroit DSA, and maybe also something for the YDSA right in Ann Arbor. We'll, once we have all those details firmed up, we'll talk about that. But the man of the hour is here, so Jake and Andy, I will see you in the post game. And we are now joined by, for the first time in GTA history, new character in the GTA extended universe, Daniel Tutt.
Dan,
what's going on? Good evening. That was quite enjoyable to listen to Jason. Excited for his new article. Where's that going to be, in Sublation?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I think
Very
I'm also
nice.
going to start characterizing myself as a fucking professional dick puncher at this point. What did Jason say? Or what did you say, Ben? Like a very good professional dick puncher.
Yeah, I said your dick punching hand was strong.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to fucking throw that on my resume.
Material he subjects himself to. Which, speaking of which, I was thinking about Nietzsche and various people's appropriations of Nietzsche, and our graphic designer, J. Andrew World was doing, one of the, bits of dick punching that he does for the show is he trolls through Rumble, looking for content to clip and have fun with on the show. And he found this. I'm not gonna, we're only gonna play part of the actual video because it's, there's a lot, but we're going to watch like the first 40 seconds or something of something that this might be the best part, actually, that the title of the video is like wisdom from ancient philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. So,
Wow.
Nice.
either the 19th century is ancient now or somebody's confused, but let's lay it on me.
Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, and if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. To live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. That which does not kill us makes us stronger. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Hope in reality is the worst of all evils because it prolongs the torments of man.
Yeah, and it just goes on and on and on like that. And
All the banger.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the greatest hits compilation of decontextualized sentences from Nietzsche, which of course reminds me of a book that I have been reading called How to Read Like a Parasite by Daniel Tutt. I think we have a graphic for that. Why the left got high on Nietzsche. So yeah, you're here to help us detox. And one of the one of the themes of the book
Not
is
that kind of high. There's multiple meanings of high there.
okay. All right.
Oh, well, I mean,
We'll
you say that.
We'll get to that. We'll get to
If
that.
you spend a lot of time in undergrad around philosophy types, then the odds of being high and reading Nietzsche are fairly good. And I will say it's not at all a fucking unrewarding experience if you get to go through it, although it can be a little bit of a dismal time if you're with the wrong people also.
Well, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, I mean, I feel
Well,
like
Nietzsche can actually bring a lot of people off of drugs because
Yeah,
it's a
that's
different
true.
kind of, it's a different kind of high. Different kind of high.
You go.
You don't really need drugs when you're really engaged with his work.
the heroin, the methadone, and the methadone to the Nietzsche. Fair
Yep.
enough. Yeah, Matt, you were saying.
Oh, I was gonna say no. Like, I mean, the only time I've ever actually felt like I was fucking staring into the abyss and the abyss was staring back at me wasn't actually when I was ever on drugs or even when I was drunk, but when I was reading Curtis Yarvin's works back to back. At that point, I really did start to sit there and think to myself, like, what am I doing with my life and how did I wind up here and what does it all mean? And fucking should I just, decide to do something else like go gardening or something like that? But that one never resonated with me all that much aside from that moment.
Yeah, you gotta space out those.
I can't wait for you guys to analyze the upcoming debate with Richard Hanina.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Monarchy and democracy. That's a very Nietzschean debate. Very Nietzschean. And they are both self-avowed Nietzscheans.
Yeah.
It's almost like we on the left debate Nietzsche. This is their version of the debate of Nietzsche, internal to the right.
I don't know. It reminded me a bit of like the David Frum versus Steve Bannon debate that took place in Toronto, where it's like, do you think of war crimes or hate crimes is worse? I'm like, I don't know. It's hard for me to get riled up behind that one.
Well, the thing that I always thought was striking about that Bannon Frum one is that, like there was so little that was actually being debated there. That there was like a lot of rhetoric where Bannon was throwing out about salt of the earth working class deplorables, and like there was a lot of rhetoric from Frum about how Bannon was a fascist, but like there was never but like if there were any actual policy disagreements, I missed them, right, throughout the debate, because it's like, I don't know, I mean, they're both Republicans. I mean, like I think they actually largely want the same stuff. They have different messaging strategies. Whereas at least with Yarvin and Hanania, there's
Is that how you say it? Hanania?
No, I'm sure it's not how you say it. I have no idea.
I don't know either.
But yeah, like Richard H is, I mean, they're both like just really among the most vile people I can think of. I have been,
and that's like not a short list for you either.
although
certainly Yarvin's certainly the most vile. Actually, hold on. Yarvin is not maybe objectively the most vile person I've ever been in a room with, but like he's, I think you could make a good case for some of the others, but he is maybe the most off-putting.
Yeah, I can see that, because I was going to say you spent some time with Tim Pool, and I can't really say that I wouldn't want to punch Tim Pool in the face if I saw him, but I can see how Yarvin might be a little more off-putting than Tim.
Yeah. No, I think there are other people who are probably worse who have been in debates with, but but here at least, as much as these are just both like just like awful specimens, I can at least maybe see what they're arguing about a little bit more, because Hanania is a self-described Nietzschean liberal. That's how he describes his politics.
But only because contemporary liberalism retains an adequate level of inegalitarianism for him to support it. So it's likely that their debate will cash out around that question. Like, is the contemporary inequality adequate to sort of keep the plebs in their place, so to speak?
Yeah, because I think one thing they do likely agree on, and that probably does, I mean, to touch on what you're talking about in the book, probably does get back to a considerable at least connect to what they both see and like in Nietzsche, is that surely these guys agree that ordinary people should be largely kept away from decision making, right? So the question at that point is, does sort of highly neoliberalized kind of managed democracy in the way that we have it right now do the trick, right? Or is that still too susceptible to popular pressure? So we really need, I don't know, Elon Musk to be the new Augustus or whatever, Yarvin wants.
Yeah, I mean, that essay by Hanania was really deflating in a lot of ways. Now, to be clear, he makes it obvious at the beginning that, as he puts it, he is not a philosopher. So he's just kind of ruminating on these questions on an armchair fashion. But there's just something inherently lazy about his entire approach, where he's like, well, I'm a liberal Nietzschean because I believe in utilitarianism up to this point, because at that point, I think that aspiring to greatness is also really, really important. And too much utilitarianism would lead to the kind of egalitarian connotations that Dan was talking about. So we need to complement it with a little bit of Nietzscheanism. And I'm like, well, why don't we just fucking make a harlequin out of every philosopher at this point? Take a little from that, a little from that, a little from that, just hit it all together and end up with some kind of chimerical creation and call it logical, right? Why the fuck not? If we're going to be that lazy, we'll just fucking stitch whatever we want together again.
Yeah. So I think there are a few ways into the book, and probably in a minute we want to like take a long step back and think about the larger, thing that you're doing when you're writing it and what you're trying to intervene in and all of that. But like, just because of what we were just talking about, it might be, useful to just get right into it with the stuff about liberalism. Because, one thing that, was striking me about actually part of what I was just reading in the book was, that there's this, intra-left disagreement about how to think about liberalism, that I think the way you set up Nietzsche's relationship to liberalism in the book with is, it's maybe interesting kind of trying to place you on this because one view about, liberalism in the broadest sense is that this is bourgeois ideology, and there's this kind of nothing that's like of value there. And another possible view that you can take is actually the sort of ideals of Enlightenment liberalism are good actually, but capitalism doesn't really cash the check that
Right.
sort of liberal capitalist democracies don't really give us, to go back to the French Revolution stuff you talk about in the book, they don't really give us meaningful, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So we need socialism to sort of fulfill the promises of liberalism. And what I found interesting and what I'd kind of like to hear you speak to, and then kind of hear from Matt about, is that, in the book, in a certain sense, you maybe seem to do both a little bit, or maybe you're like slicing up the categories in a little bit of a different way that I just did, right? Because you do kind of make that second point about the ideals of the French Revolution. But at the same time, mostly when you use the word liberalism in the book, it's, not a good thing, right? So, I mean, before we even kind of get to how Nietzsche relates, I would kind of be interested in your thoughts about that broader context.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to call Nietzsche a proto-fascist or an aristocratic madman as a leftist, to critique him that way. And then for a true Nietzschean on the left, there's no dialogue to be had. But if you call Nietzsche a liberal, that they're going to be quite upset about that, actually, because that sort of demobilizes the whole project, right? So if you say that Nietzsche is a liberal Bonapartist, which is an argument I get from Don Dombowski, that actually means something quite different about the sort of political Nietzsche. And we can talk about the distinction between the kind of metaphysical Nietzsche and the political Nietzsche. For Heidegger, they're kind of conflated. I actually think, more that I read, Heidegger is probably more responsible for the depoliticizing of Nietzsche than is Walter Kaufmann, precisely because he reads everything back to a fundamental metaphysical contribution of Nietzsche. Mm-hmm. But Nietzsche nonetheless argued that liberalism, right, bourgeois liberalism, was what he called petty politics, ultimately. And he sort of becomes a sort of provocateur to the bourgeois liberal intelligentsia. So there's sort of one way to think about what Nietzsche's actually doing, is trying to provoke bourgeois intellectuals out of their slumber to embrace a certain scenario of a certain form of radical politics, which we could furthermore understand in a mimetic relationship to socialism. In other words, Nietzschean politics is an effort to mute socialist politics by parasitically inhabiting it and shutting down the class struggle, right? So Nietzsche therefore latches on to politics to eliminate the kind of Marxist core of them. Now, this is the argument of Lukács in The Destruction of Reason. Mm-hmm. And in that text, it's not accurate to say that Lukács is in favor of liberalism by any means. It's rather to say that Lukács understands that in the wake of the rights of man, of the Jacobins, of the great modern French Revolution, there were what we could call unmet political demands that sort of exist in the political ether, in the civil society. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on. They kind of anchor political life. They anchor a sense of the universal They anchor a sense of commonality. Now, Nietzsche was, in political terms, his primary enemy, of course, was Rousseau, right? So what Nietzsche is trying to do is eradicate those particular, he's sort of trying, what I say, to take the egalitarian genie of the French Revolution and put it back in the bottle. That's Nietzscheanism. Now, the effect of that, I argue, is basically a kind of stabilizing force. So it's a kind of romantic anti-capitalism for the preservation, like Richard Hanina, similar to this, of kind of existing relations of exploitation, right? So a lot of Nietzsche's work on the working class, on political economy, he wrote widely on political economy, really is, I think, best understood as a kind of liberal restorationist type of politics. It's a kind of, some people could call this an anti-politics. We can get into that. But this is the sort of basic argument. So how liberalism intersects with that is complex, because that implies a certain understanding of decadence and crisis of the bourgeois system. Because decadence is also understood as a crisis also of legitimacy of the bourgeois class itself. So a lot of what Nietzsche is writing about is the crisis of rulers, of managers, of heads of state. He exchanges a lot of letters to heads of state, for example. So there's a sense in which we need to define how we understand liberalism. I know Matt and I recently had a long conversation and debate on this. I'd like to hear where you fall on this. And I know that you're also an admirer of this particular Lukács that I incorporate. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is my basic view, Ben.
Gotcha. Matt?
Sure. Well, there are two things that I want to say about this, and both of them pertain to situating Nietzsche on the political right, which I think is a very important task. And I think it's important to make clear that he does belong there, right? He's not some kind of liberal or leftist bohemian, the way that he was once upon a time made out. So the first is, there's this interpretation of the political right that essentially runs that the main thing that people on the right want is to conserve, right? To use the kind of Burkean mantra, to reform what we must in order to preserve what we can. And without a doubt, that is an important strand of right-wing thought that's been hugely influential. But Corey Robin emphasizes very rightly in The Reactionary Mind that it's by no means exhaustive of the kind of views that can appear on the right. Because to use Robin's terms, when people on the right feel that the left has been in the driver's seat for too long, as Nietzsche certainly thinks it has been in the driver's seat for too long, they can very often become much more militant and insist that conserving is no longer enough. What we need is big, bold, and radical change. And Nietzsche very much falls into this camp, right? If you read The Gay Science, particularly the closing chapters, he makes it very clear that he is not interested in conserving anything, and certainly does not conceive himself as a conservative, although he also lambasts liberals and socialists for being, in many ways, worse, right? The second thing I want to stress is that there's this view of the political right as, in some senses, fundamentally anti-utopian, or wary of postulating grand or radical proposals for change. This view is also really misguided, right? People on the political right, particularly those on the radical right, are very capable of postulating ideals for higher or more noble or less decadent kinds of societies. Fascism is probably the most emblematic example of this. But Nietzsche most definitely falls into this camp, particularly in his later mature work, where he looks forward to the era of great politics appearing, where the decadent shackles that have been imposed upon humanity by creeping nihilism, particularly in its liberal, socialist, and democratic forms, is overthrown. And we see life-affirming individuals appear who will essentially be unreserved about demanding the establishment of a slave class that will be necessarily be the material basis for them to pursue these kinds of higher order activities, right? So these are the two things that I think are important to understand about where Nietzsche should be situated on the political right. He's definitely a radical rightist in the sense of thinking that the left has been in the driver's seat in Western culture for far too long, arguably going all the way back to the emergence of Christianity, although you could go to Plato if you really wanted to. And he also is projecting a very different kind of vision for where we should be going as a society, one where Otto von Bismarck is too progressive for him. If you read The Antichrist, where he talks about how Bismarck is making this really foolish decision of enfranchising the lower orders a little bit and offering them some social benefits, and we shouldn't be doing that, right? So Nietzsche has a very interesting and distinct kind of utopian view about what should replace the kind of decadent societies that appear right now. We can talk about that a little bit later, but I think that the most emblematic statement to this effect is actually in The Will to Power, which is also a useful point where we can talk about where he's different from liberals. Because in The Will to Power, he makes this offhand remark where he says, I am not an individualist and I should not be understood as such, right? My philosophy is concerned first and foremost with delineations of rank, right? So certain people should be individualists, right? He's very clear about that. But they can only become individualists if they are sufficiently superior to have earned it, right? And the requirement, the material requirement for them to be able to express their individuality fully is, of course, the establishment of an aristocratic society with a large basis in slavery.
But wait, can I say one thing? Can I say one thing? The basis of rank is to be understood primarily not only through the market. This is an interesting debate.
Yeah, very
because
good.
you will get right-wing Nietzscheans who are libertarian, who will say that rank can be determined imminently based on market competition. And I talk about this in the book. Peter Sloterdijk's a good example of somebody that kind of supports this view, right? That this kind of neoliberal, fluid, entrepreneurial society is the best ranking system that kind of naturally adheres in order. But I'm actually of the mind that Nietzsche's more interested in physiological and psychological forms of rank, which capitalism perverts. So there does need to be some kind of transformation. But the nature of that transformation must adhere to what Nietzsche calls the pathos of distance, which means that the subjugated class must come into being, come into their condition in such a way, and here it's a very sophisticated and very ingenious, insidious argument that he puts forward. The slave class or the working class, we could say in capitalism, I think this is another problem, is that we read Nietzsche as a kind of ahistorical thinker. So we don't read him as a critic of capitalism, but he really is, right? And we should read him that way, right? So because what he's concerned with is suffering, right? This is, if you read Zarathustra, suffering is put at the very center of the objective of the higher man. And it is to create a segregation between workers and a kind of elect that is, and this is where Marx comes into play, is sort of exempt from wage labor. And this introduces Nietzsche and leisure time as a very central demand and theme of Nietzsche that is something that socialists must learn from Nietzsche, must parasitically learn from Nietzsche in a very important way as a negative lesson. Obviously, we don't go in his direction. But you see, that's his vision. It's a quite radical one. And it is the one, Ben, where accusations, of the proto-fascism piece will come into play. Because if you have a society structured on pathos of distance, where you force this division and you eradicate egalitarianism and inequality completely from the social order, and you have a subjugated class who must be happy in their toil, and if they're not, they're eligible for annihilation, he says at times. What's the meaning of this? What's the meaning of if you are a failed individual, you should be eligible for annihilation or for destruction? And there's a debate. So these are the questions that lead some people to think that Nietzsche is a proto-fascist. But I would argue that that itself may be valid, but also is reductive because of the profound multiple readings that people have had of this philosopher. He's not just owned by the fascists, right?
Yeah.
There is even like a sort of problem about how, there's a extensive debate, which actually I hope to get into a little bit, because obviously both of you guys are on one, very strongly defined side of it, and I'm a little bit more ambivalent about the extent to which what Nietzsche is doing, is a political project, or whether it's that, he's talking about a number of subjects, and sure, he's got some, extremely right-wing political views that are, that you get here and there, but it's not really the central animus, right, of the whole thing. But even on the sort of reading where it is the central animus, the whole thing, one of the sort of odd things about thinking about, Nietzsche as a proto-fascist is, and even in a way about the Bonapartist stuff, although I think it's probably a bigger problem for fascism, is that, fascism is a mass movement, right? Like this is, it's you actually need popular politics for fascism, and whatever Nietzsche is up to, and however wherever you go in those multiple interpretations you're talking about, one thing that's very clear is that he doesn't see himself as speaking to everybody, right? That he goes out of his way to say, like even going back to the Birth of Tragedy, right? He sort of says, yeah, Richard Wagner will understand this book, and like maybe 5 other people, and whatever, I'm content with that, right? Most people just aren't going to get what I'm doing, right? That he is very, very explicitly not interested in sort of trying to speak to and mobilize the passions of ordinary people in ways that like anything like a successful fascist movement would have to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I tend to take my definition of fascism from Roger Griffin, which is that it's a populist form of palingenetic ultranationalism, right? It is worth noting that many of the major fascist politicians, and for that matter, theorists, were profoundly influenced by Nietzsche. But some of the more self-conscious ones, like Mussolini, were very overt about the fact that they were adapting, which is really a bad way of saying plagiarizing and stealing, right? His ideas, pushing them in a more populist direction, precisely by suggesting that this kind of aristocratic status that he assumed belonged only to the rarefied few could be extended downwards to the nation as a whole, often in very transparently racialized ways, right? Suggesting that, well, the glorious German people or the glorious Italian people, they constitute the master race that's destined to rule over all. Nietzsche wouldn't have any kind of truck with that, right? Say whatever you will about him. While he does express a deep amount of concern for breeding and can often make some hideously racist comments, he was always deeply contemptuous of anti-Semites, people who pushed for kind of nationalist programs. He often labeled himself a good European. And I think that's precisely because he thinks that there's this demotic quality to all these attempts to kind of push his thinking or push any right-wing thinking in a right-wing populist direction that he's just fundamentally allergic to. But I want to come back to the point about the market that Dan raised, which I think is so important, right? So Nietzsche himself was very transparently contemptuous of what he called liberalism, which is kind of his synonym for those who propose a market society. So in The Twilight of the Idols, he says, liberalism basically dissolves itself whenever it attempts to establish itself, precisely because it universalizes certain kinds of value systems that should only be available to the elect few. And later on in the same quote, he says that liberalism is a kind of philosophy that's fit for shopkeepers and Englishmen, cows, women, Christians, and basically everybody else that's in his familiar litany of the unworthy, right? And it's not hard to see why he would therefore have a kind of appeal to many people on the left and the right, because I do think that fundamentally he has this kind of anti-bourgeois quality that creeps up in his work. Certainly when you get past the middle period, where I think you could read him as a kind of very elitist liberal if you want. But by the time the late period gets in, he's very emphatic about the fact that liberalism, capitalism, socialism, democracy, if they're not all the same thing, they're at least branches in the same rotten plant, and they all need to, the whole plant needs to be cut down, and we need to start over again, right? Now, in terms of how somebody who seems so fundamentally anti-capitalist could nonetheless be picked up by figures like, say, Ayn Rand, I'll use her as my example, I think it's very obvious how that could happen, right? Ayn Rand, by the way, I should add, was fascinated by Nietzsche. She never acknowledged the profound influence that he had on her, in part because she never wanted to acknowledge a debt to anybody except for Aristotle. But that was very misleading, right? You can read, if you want, Jennifer Burns' book, Goddess of the Market, where she points out that even as late as her mature works, Ayn Rand would constantly talk about how Nietzschean themes were infecting her work, and how she had even had some of her characters basically paraphrase certain Nietzschean ideas. For instance, when his characters laugh. And when she was younger, she even had a very creepy digression in her dialogue where she talks about how a murderer is the most free kind of man who exists beyond good and evil, and how he's a fascinating figure because he's not restrained by society the way that so many other people are, and he's willing to transgress the kind of herd morality, which tells you a lot about Ayn Rand. But, nonetheless, she kind of recognized in this almost schmaltzy way that advocating for this kind of esoteric German aristocraticism really wouldn't have a lot of traction in the United States. So she did really the quite clever thing of saying that, well, actually, the aristocrats are essentially the capitalists in modern day America, the people who build the skyscrapers that she so admired when she landed in New York, right? And no surprise, many very wealthy people in the United States were quite receptive to that message, right? And still are, for that matter. And I think that it's precisely the receptivity of this message on the part of wealthy elites that speaks to Ayn Rand's enormous popularity right now, and the fact that she was, and the kind of proto-popularity of these liberal Nietzschean ideas that allow really quite, vulgar people who Nietzsche would be deeply contemptuous of to think of themselves as something like the Ubermensch because they happen to be the CEO of Tesla or whatever it happens to be.
Well, I do have a section on H.L. Mencken, who was Ayn Rand's literal American mentor, protege, I don't know, you could say. I don't know if you all know who he is. Ben, if you don't know about him, it's worth some research, but he was this kind of unabashed American Nietzschean from about the 1910s to the 30s, and he was like a literary gadfly. He had no academic post, but he was this kind of freelance literary figure, but he wrote literally I don't know, an article a day. He's kind of like you, Ben, and Jacobin, but he's on the right. And he was very prolific.
It'd be a lot nicer if they'd take one a day, but yeah, I gotcha.
You probably would write one if they would, right?
Yeah, probably actually. Yeah.
But Mencken, yeah, I think Ayn Rand dedicated her first book to him. Okay, he wrote the foreword, or the forewords to multiple Nietzsche translations by Oscar Levy. Okay, which was a deeply anti-Semitic portrayal of Nietzsche. Right, this is still in the Elizabeth Forster days, and this is when we had the famous Nietzschean murder take place with Leopold and Loeb, the two boys at University of Chicago. Alfred Hitchcock made a film called Rope about this.
I still haven't seen that. Is it worth seeing? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
it's pretty cool. Yeah, that is cool.
It's totally worth seeing, and it's
not the best Hitchcock film, but I mean, if you're into Nietzsche, it's worth it.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw it into the DVD pile then. Okay.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. It's not. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's not his best, but it's a very watchable, very short thing. It's fun. I mean, it's actually funny. Before you said that, I was thinking about Leopold and Loeb because I was kind of thinking back to my how I felt about Nietzsche in the past as I was reading some of this, and I could remember. I can remember, I think being home from college or something, and I had a Nietzsche book, and and I said something about Nietzsche, and I remember my mom being like, "Oh, gross," and I was kind of asked her about it. She was like, "I don't know. My only real association with Nietzsche is the Leopold and Loeb murder," and so I was kind of thinking back to it. It's have I gotten closer to seeing the guy in that light, since in the decades since then? I don't know, but yeah, right. Okay, so you're talking about.
I mean, it is striking. Let's just say something very quick.
Yeah.
When I put my book out and I say Nietzsche is a reactionary.
Yeah.
After Nietzsche and Philosophy, published in 1963 by Gilles Deleuze, after Walter Kaufmann's translations, after Heidegger, after this argument that there's no politics in Nietzsche, I have people now saying, "How dare you say that? How dare you say that?" But the irony is okay, well, why don't you look at history? Do you have any idea?
I get exactly the same emails, and it's so frustrating, right? Just these
do you have any idea how people have grappled with this thinker? I mean, to suggest that there's not a deeply problematic political thing here, or to sideline that. It just seems strange to me. I don't know what you guys think.
I know, and it's also so frustrating. This is just me venting for a few seconds, where people are like, "You're trying to read something into him that's not there." I'm like, I don't know that Nietzsche is exactly famous for his subtlety, right? And To employ Lacerdo's terms, there's something very unusual about how eager people are to apply a kind of hermeneutics of innocence to a thinker who was emblematically a member of the school of suspicion, right? Who was always willing to perceive negative motivations behind almost everybody who wrote who he didn't like, right? Like, look, if you go and you read Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche is very transparent about the fact that he thinks an aristocratic society will be the highest kind of society. It's the only kind of society that he thinks has ever been able to produce any kind of meaning given culture. And then he goes on to ruminate about how, well, a properly functioning aristocratic society is going to need a slave class, right? And this slave class doesn't even really need to get a lot from the aristocracy because the purpose of life is ultimately the production of these great people, not necessarily what these great people are going to contribute downwards, right? And it's all there in a couple of like epigrams. It's very forward, right? And I'm like, look, just read that, right? I mean, it's not exactly like he's sitting there being like elliptical about it.
So let me,
well, no, he is though, but he also is.
Yeah. So I want to get into this because just to take a minute to play, devil's advocate, or I don't know, at least Walter Kaufman's advocate,
Antichrist's advocate for the Antichrist.
Yeah, Antichrist advocate. I had like, here's like a fairly straightforward case, and I think what sounded like Dan was about to say is going to connect to this. Here's a straightforward case. As you said, it's all there in a couple of epigrams. So the question, the interpretive question is, how do those epigrams, how do, the reactionary comments and letters, etc., how does that connect with this much larger body of work? What's the relationship, between the two, right? Because if somebody's saying, oh, I don't think Nietzsche had any political opinions, then I agree with you that it's like clearly like that's not even an interesting conversation, clearly wrong, right? But if they say, I don't think that those political opinions were in the driver's seat, motivating most of what he's writing about, that's a more interesting argument and like I think a debate where you have more plausible sides because for one thing, most of the time, right, the great majority of the time, right, he's certainly not explicitly writing about politics. He's writing about various, kinds of, existential, moral, spiritual is not a word, but like whatever thing, things, subjects of that nature. That's certainly what, most readers have gotten from it. And you do have like, so for example, if you look at something like, if anybody wants to know, kind of what this straightforward statement of the, like, there isn't a sort of driving, political agenda behind all this looks like. I mean, if you could just navigate over to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll see this article, Nietzsche's Moral and Political Philosophy from Brian Leiter, and you read it. And one of the, you'll get this argument. He says that the section from Ecce Homo concludes with the hyperbolic claim that only with Nietzsche does, quote, the earth know great politics, does as little to establish that he has political philosophy as the claim in the very same passage that Nietzsche's glad tidings will cause upheavals, a convulsion of earthquakes, a moving of mountains and valleys, does to establish that he has a geological theory. And he says, he goes on to say a couple paragraphs later, those who claim to find a political philosophy in Nietzsche typically rely on a handful of passages, most often sections 56 to 7 of the Antichrist, but also Beyond Good and Evil 257 on slavery, as the slender evidence and the basis of which elaborate views about the ideal forms of social and political organization are attributed to Nietzsche. And so again, I know both of you guys are very much on the side of no, this is the driving thing, right? But like I guess I wonder like, and I don't want to exaggerate because I know neither of you would say like, oh, this means that there's nothing of value there, or just stick it all, stick it all in the incinerator. You obviously don't, right? You obviously think there is something interesting there, that you sort of have to engage with all of this in an honest way to get to. But I mean, what would you say to that? I mean, because surely, you know, if you want to sort of read anything through a primarily political prism, right, you can, right, but I hope, right, like, just, you know, being a historical materialist, you know, doesn't just commit you to saying that like everything everybody ever says, right, is you know, should be primarily understood in terms of a set of class interests. You know, that you know, when, you know, Gettier is giving us the Gettier problem, it's really because he's interested in how we can know that the working class should be subservient, right? So I know I know that's a caricature. I know that that's not your view, but I would be interested, maybe starting with Dan, and just kind of how you would push back against, you know, people who have more of that view in that like later quote.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, part of this is the seduction of Nietzsche himself. It requires almost a psychoanalytic answer, in the sense that he seduces also the academics. In my book, I cite that very page you showed on the screen, and I say there's not one Marxist critic that appears on that page of Nietzsche, because they don't fall apparently within the kind of acceptable philosophical interpretation of Nietzsche. So that community of Nietzschean scholars have a lot of idiosyncratic and peculiar rules about how they use Nietzschean concepts. We also see this in Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche, which is Nietzsche is an inventor of concepts. And in a sense, these concepts don't necessarily have a particular unity. Deleuze says that the aphorism itself signifies nothing. Derrida says that most of Nietzsche is indeterminate in terms of arriving at a final meaning. This is part of the reason why Nietzsche is the godfather of postmodernism, right? So all of those things are valid to up to a point. But here's the point at which they're not valid. When we say we want to unify Nietzsche with Marx, it's at that point that things become quite mercurial and unclear for me. In what sense? Well, in the sense that a whole history of Nietzscheans on the right, take even Leo Strauss, for example, in his lectures on Zarathustra and his writings on Nietzsche, will always honor and recognize the centrality of politics in Nietzsche. Nietzsche himself recognizes that.
Yeah.
Lukács says that Nietzsche is more political than Marx. Why? Because Nietzsche politicizes domains of human experience in life, art, the family, way more than Marx would, right? So Nietzsche is kind of like a hyper-political thinker. Furthermore, when we center politics, we understand the kind of architecture and the unity and the design of his concepts in a way that actually is coherent, right? So we can understand how will to power, the eternal return, the pathos of distance are tied into a community building project. And if we furthermore show that that community building project is, like I said before, a kind of inverted Marxist praxis, like inventing a proletariat or inventing a community, it's then therefore a theory of leadership, a political leadership. And so we bring in a certain repressed version of a philosophy into the left in an effort to fuse it with Marx, but we have removed half of his content in doing so. So it's too partial for me to just say he's an analytic thinker of thought experiments, like Leader says, or to say that he's primarily an indeterminate aesthetic thinker, like Derrida says. I think he's fuller than that. He's not reducible just to that. And the politics allows a richer Nietzsche for me. That's what I would say.
Yeah, just following up. I want to make it very clear, right? I think that Lukács' book has remarkable insights into Nietzsche's politics, and for that matter, into the German right and the origins of fascism generally, right? But I strongly disagree with any reading that tries to reduce Nietzsche down to essentially just a critic of socialism, right? Or suggest that really his main target throughout his entire career was ultimately socialism, even if he wrote about a whole lot of other things on top of that, right? I actually tend to agree with a man called Daniel Tutt's reading of Nietzsche for the left, which is that if we are going to read Nietzsche to try to provide insights to left-wing thought, then we need to read parasitically, right? Recognizing that, we are cutting things off of a reactionary edifice and putting them to our own purposes. But I also think that you can even give a kind of apolitical reading of Nietzsche that foregrounds, as Ben put it, the kind of existential, metaphysical, or epistemological dimensions of his thought in ways that can be very interesting and very productive, right? I think that, for instance, Richard Rorty occasionally did that, right? Richard Rorty connected this to a politics eventually, but saying, look, if we just think of truth as a moving army of metaphors, that can actually be very useful in terms of trying to frame a proper epistemic outlook. But to suggest that Nietzsche really doesn't have a politics, or that his politics isn't really central to his work, or that there are just a few passages where he ruminates on politics, and these are scattered throughout his works, and that people are just appealing to a couple of paragraphs or aphorisms in Beyond Good and Evil and the Antichrist, I just think that that's insincere, right? You can make a very compelling argument that the entirety of Nietzsche's arguably greatest work, The Genealogy of Morals, is ultimately a political text, or at least it very much has politics at the foreground of its mind, with its chronicle of how the slave morality emerges out of ressentiment, kind of crystallizes into Christianity, and then gradually propagates itself across the world. And then eventually secularizes into liberalism, socialism, and democracy. But one doesn't even need to go to The Genealogy of Morals to find a very political book. Even in his middle period, Nietzsche was already starting to ruminate on many of the fundamental political themes that would stamp his maturity. So one of my favorite passages from him is actually in The Gay Science, and I'll quote it at length, where he says, "We conserve nothing, neither do we want to return to any past periods. We are not by any means liberal," in quotation marks. "We do not work for progress. We do not need to plug our ears against the sirens who in the marketplace sing of the future, their song about, quote, equal rights, a free society, no more masters and no more servants. All this has no allure for us. We simply do not consider it desirable that a realm of justice and concord should ever be established on the earth. We delight with all those who love, as we do, danger, war, and adventure, who refuse to compromise, to be captured, reconciled, and castrated. We count ourselves amongst the conquerors. We think about the necessity for new orders, also for a new slavery. For every strengthening and enhancement of the human type also involves a new kind of enslavement," right? So my argument would be to turn this around and say, well, try to account for that, right? It's not like, again, he's very subtle about what he's calling for there. If anything, he couldn't be much more overt at the end, right? About this need for conquest, love, war, adventure, excitement, right? Everything that he thinks makes life worth living. And at the end, well, we also need enslavement to ensure that there is a material basis for all this to be possible, right?
Okay, my initial negotiating position is yes to love and adventure, no to war and enslavement.
I'm all down for love and adventure, baby. You know that, right? I don't know that my views on adventure necessarily end with me needing to enslave anybody, and I'd hope not. But yeah, I'm all for love and adventure. Let's say that.
So look, this is because I don't want to get too far off here, because we've
I'll be right back.
Sure. Yes, we've been talking about the ways in which kind of whether there's a whether there's politics at all, or whether even if there are sort of political comments or political opinions, this is actually the sort of main structuring thing, behind what Nietzsche is doing. But I mean, I think a lot of what you're concerned with in the book is not even sort of, pushing back, against people who are skeptical of that, although there's some of that too, right? But really in looking at and kind of seeing the problems with people who do want to talk about Nietzsche in a political way, but think that they can do it in a left way, right? And do it without sort of, maybe understanding like what the, I don't know, to not mix metaphors too horribly here, right? What the toxic stuff is that you need to cut off, right, before you can incorporate it is. So do you want to talk just a little bit in a general way about the kind of history of left Nietzscheanism? Because there has been like these attempts at sort of a left appropriation of Nietzsche have, gone, almost back to when he was alive, right? I mean, like, like you could find stuff in the very early 20th century and then, going onward.
Yeah, sure. I really argue that there's been sort of two primary reading methods on the left when it comes to Nietzsche and the incorporation of Nietzsche on the left. The first is what I call an elective affinity reading method. And this is a kind of reading method which treats the politics as marginal or as non-substantive or as non-existent. And this emerges early on, actually, amongst Trotsky's first article published in 1900 on the philosophy of the Superman, which was possibly actually in honor of Nietzsche's death, not in honor because Trotsky's a huge critic, argued that Nietzscheanism, when it comes into the left, creates a class of readers, what he calls a parasitan proletariat, kind of a bad bohemian counterculture leftism. Okay, so the problem that Trotsky diagnoses in 1900 is this propensity for a de-emphasis away from political economy and a focus on counterculture politics. Now, that's not to say that cultural politics must be avoided by the left, because actually that's the domain in which Nietzsche gives the most meat. That's the other way to read him, what I call parasitical. Okay. And that's, we can use some sort of more, what I would say, more constructive historical examples. The first one is Kurt Eisner. He wrote a book on Nietzsche in 1893 in German. He led the Bavarian Socialist Revolution, which was a partially successful socialist revolution in 1918. Max Weber famously used him as the typical example of the charismatic leader. And he argued that Nietzsche must be read as a profound enemy to the left. But because at the time the class struggle required an overthrow of aristocratic elements in the ruling class, he wanted to use Nietzsche for workers to imbue the aristocratic ethos of Nietzsche's community building project and kind of transvalue it back for working class ends, let's say. So it's a kind of, it's a parasitical reading of Nietzsche. And that's the first, he's the kind of godfather of that method, I claim. Nietzsche then enters into the Bolsheviks in a fascinating way. Nietzsche appears in the Chinese Cultural Revolution in a fascinating way. He appears in Japan. He appears in Vietnam. Nietzsche appears anytime after his death, okay? A social order is undergoing a possible revolutionary sequence. That's my argument. He becomes inescapable, okay? Nietzsche is a thinker that latches on to moments where the status quo is undergoing a change. All of this looks a lot different after the Second World War, in part because in the West, two things happened. The Germans obviously were occupied by the French were occupied by the Nazis. Because Nietzsche was such a major figure for the Nazis, I think that the intellectual class of the French really imbued and absorbed a lot of Nietzsche. And so that meant that the 68 generation put Nietzsche at the very center of their, of the left. I mean, Deleuze wrote a manifesto called Nomad Thought in the early 60s, where he said Nietzsche is more important than Freud and Marx. Okay. So that's elective affinity. When you take Nietzsche and you say, let's not synthesize him with Marx, but let's put him at the center of the left. That's what Deleuze did. And I think that's what Bataille did. And that's what several other leftists have done. And I think that that becomes
out of curiosity, I'm
problematic.
trying to interject. Would you say that Foucault was included in that list?
Foucault. Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course, Foucault. Of course. I always neglect that. Of course, he is. I don't focus on him in my book as much because that would require like a whole other book.
I only asked this because I think it's easier to read Foucault as a materialist than some of the others, albeit with some insights. But
true.
I just wanted to know where you stood on that question.
Yeah, of course. I'm not saying that Deleuze is totally like bunkyard or that he should be. This is not me trying to say let's discard them. It's just to say that I have a disagreement with the praxis and the strategy politically, not philosophically. Okay, politically, primarily politically, because I think that it results in an anti-egalitarian left. And that to me is a kind of oxymoronic position to hold, especially in our day and age, in the neoliberal period, to have this kind of hostility to egalitarianism. It's deeply problematic to me. And when you put Nietzsche at the center of the left, it's hard to not have that. I will say that a lot of contemporary Nietzscheans working in that 68 lineage are beginning to recognize that being anti or highly critical of egalitarianism isn't exactly working out for them as much anymore. That's a bigger debate discussion we can have later. I'm going on a long thread here, Ben, but there's much
I mean,
to be
I'm
said about
applauding you and saying,
very-
keep going, right? You know, I think we
Sure.
should sing this to the heavens.
Sure. So there's these two approaches. Now, I mean, one of the arguments of my book is that, look, like Nietzsche's kind of done some damage here. Okay, Nietzsche's done a bit of damage on the left. And I mean, if you read The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, who of course was trained by Leo Strauss in Chicago, and I don't agree with either of them politically, they both had the good sense to note and to recognize.
I got bogged down
success.
when I tried to read Closing of the American Mind. I think he lost me during one of the rants about Keith Richards and the
pelvic thrusting back and forth.
Yeah. Well, he has he's lectures on Nietzsche that I listened to, and I read all of his stuff on Nietzsche as well as Strauss's, and I found that actually they have a correct take on the kind of hypocrisy of incorporating Nietzsche on the left, right? Which is that the left kind of abandons the left goes too high. Like they abandon the workers, they abandon the more modest goal of working class emancipation, and working class emancipation begins to look very different when you put Nietzsche in the driver's seat. So, but this is part of what the ludic and counterculture emphasis of the 68 rebellion has done to the left in some sense. And Nietzsche is partially responsible for that at a very high intellectual level. And so my book is an effort to sort of rein back in and have a new critical dialogue and analysis of what the meaning of that is today, and to sort of revisit Nietzsche also, because you see, none of these thinkers really understood Nietzsche as an enemy to the left. And if anything, they never talked about his politics. It was always left indeterminate or interpretable or whatever you want it to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I don't think that that's correct, okay? And I think that that's had a certain damage, because as Eisner shows, the first parasitical reader of Nietzsche, the left benefits when we actually turn Nietzsche, and Nietzsche actually says this is how he wants leftist readers to read him, by the way, as enemies, okay? There becomes a certain friction and a certain tension when you read him as a kind of adversary to your objectives that I think is more honest, right? So if Nietzsche puts the virtue of honesty at the very highest point in his philosophy, I think that this method of reading him is much more honest, okay, but also possibly even more productive for the left, because it regrounds us. And I mean, I don't want to be too grandiose, but it brings us back to the old classical revolutionary tradition. And then we can have a different debate about liberalism in that context in some sense.
I'd like to follow this up actually by saying two things, right? I completely agree about the equality point, but I'd like to preface it by talking about how one of the problems that has emerged by Nietzsche's influence, or through Nietzsche's influence on the left, is the adoption of this kind of aristocratic attitude towards political agitation that I actually think you capture very well in your book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, Ben, where you talk about how the the left almost adopts this kind of aesthetic sensibility in the post-1980s, when the material conditions for radical social change are gone. And the primary way that you know a leftist is when they start saying things like, well, my argument is very interesting or very radical or very transformative, right? Or it really upends bourgeois sensibilities. And, aligned with this is this belief that anything that communicates in a kind of democratic form or appeals to universalistic reason is inherently to be regarded with great suspicion, right? And anything that aspires to any level of mass politics also is to be regarded with great suspicion, because there's something vulgar or crass about any form of communication that can be understood by a large number of people, because it means you're not being sufficiently radical or transformative or interesting, right? Now, I don't blame Nietzsche for that. I'm a materialist, so I think that a lot of that has to do with changing material conditions. But Richard Rowland wrote a fantastic book about this, called The Seduction of Unreason, where he points out that genealogically, Nietzsche stamped a lot of these dispositions, and I think the left, in some respects, would be better off without them, at least in some circumstances.
No, I mean, for sure. I mean, like, look, you know, Nietzsche is, like many things, kind of all over the place on this. You know, there's a line in the Gay Science that I used to have on, like, I don't know, 20 versions of Facebook ago in like 2007 or something, when people had the quotes at the bottom of the profile, right? One of mine was from there, where it says that those who you know, would like to be thought profound strive to be obscure. Those who know they're profound strive to be clear. And, you know, he says that, but he also says a bunch of things that are quoted in Daniel's book about how actually you're not supposed to get what he's saying, and, you know, and that there's this esoteric meaning and all of that. But, you know, part of what I was thinking about while you're saying this, and connected back to what Daniel was saying earlier about, you know, liberalism, is, you know, when you and I have talked about this, Matt, right? I mean, like, you know, like, you say a lot of things about liberalism that I completely agree with, right? That I think that there's this sort of, you know, liberalism in this, like, very broad historical sense is this sort of, you know, like these basic philosophical premises about universal rights and equality and all of that stuff. You know, I think all of that's good, right? And, you know, and I, you know, I am very much in favor of saying, yeah, the problem with capitalism is that it hasn't delivered on the liberty and the equality and the fraternity. But, you know, part of the reason that I don't, you know, I don't, like, embrace the L word quite the way that you do is that it's, well, look, part of it's just that, like, the people we tend to be thinking of when we use the word liberal in America in the 21st century are, like, my least favorite people. And, you know, and
I'm with her, and, you know, my plan is plenty radical, Pete Buttigieg type.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and in fact, I even think that, like, you know, my criticism of a lot of leftists is that I think there's a sense in which they've imbibed too much from liberalism in that sense, right? And I think that, you know, it's not even just sort of like whatever annoying Democrats are saying today. There is, like, an actual ideological thing that, you know, I think when we're thinking about liberalism in, you know, in the United States and similar societies in the early 21st century, I think to a great extent what we're talking about is this kind of managerial, like, I don't know, kind of half meritocratic, half technocratic view of the world that, in some ways, I mean, I actually think one way of framing the criticism is that it's a very Nietzschean kind of liberalism, that it's all about, you know, that idea that the purpose of society is to produce the higher people, right? It's like, well, look, the kind of liberalism that, you know, that again, I think is all over the place, even though it's usually not that self-conscious, you know, is the kind that says social justice is all about clearing away, you know, arbitrary barriers to the best and brightest from each demographic group, rising to the top, so we can, you know, we can have, you know, the correct proportion of Black lesbians on the board of directors of Raytheon, and in, you know, and in, you know, the Senate and all of that. And, you know, and that way they'll sort of come up with the best solutions to the problems that we have. Right. And it's that kind of, you know, cause ultimately there's this sort of depoliticized technocratic way of thinking about government that's lurking behind a lot of that stuff. And the thing that seems very Nietzschean about this is the idea that's like, yeah, it doesn't really matter what happens at the bottom, right? That's sort of irrelevant, right? I mean, that only kind of exists to support the stuff at the top, right? What really matters is that the exceptional people rise to their proper place.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to be very clear. I think that there's most definitely a kind of Nietzschean liberalism that is extremely popular in the United States today, even though I think that Nietzsche himself would be quite contemptuous of it. And, you know, Hanania is just an emblematic figure in that respect. I just want to say one thing, well, two things quickly, and then I'll throw it back to Dan. Also, just want to make it very clear, I love Dan's book, and I have endorsed it very, very highly. And everybody should read it, and hopefully, it will sell more copies than the Bible. But
Yeah,
first off,
there are like 5 quotes at the beginning, and one of them is you, and one of them is Slavoj Žižek, and one of them is you, and I forget who the other people are. But yeah, that's it comes highly recommended.
Yeah, well, I'm in good company then. But first off, part of this is just a little ressentiment on my part about the way that certain kinds of liberalism have been underappreciated by the political left. So I do think that there is something very odd about the fact that if I were when I was going through university, most leftists I know would much rather spend time with Big Gone, Good and Evil rather than, say, A Theory of Justice. Although if you read, Rawls's lectures on political economy, just go to the chapters on Marx. The first thing he says is Marx is fundamentally a heroic figure, a man of genius. Liberals have a lot to learn from him. Actually, anybody who says in the liberal tradition that Marxism is passé because the Cold War is over is making a very serious mistake. And in fact, we have tremendous amounts to still learn from Marx, particularly about the need to transition to a post-capitalist society. So that's just kind of odd to me, right? This kind of preference for somebody who called socialism, essentially the thing that he hated the most, right? The socialists, the anarchists, the Christians, right? Everybody who has these kind of bourgeois or soft egalitarian sentiments about needing to look after the lower orders. But to the broader point about how we can read Nietzsche like a parasite or put him to useful purposes with the left, I think that there are many good examples of that, throughout the history of left political thought. Sheldon Wolin is probably the most emblematic figure in that respect, who learned an enormous amount from Nietzsche and put it to productive use. But my favorite political theorist working today is a woman called Wendy Brown, who far too few people in the public sphere have heard about. I think she makes brilliant use of Nietzschean themes precisely to criticize what we might call a Nietzschean kind of liberalism. Since one of the things that she points out as a limitation in Nietzsche's work, as Brown does, Nietzsche will almost always focus on the ressentiment animating what he takes to be various different kinds of egalitarian social movements, right? Whether talking about liberalism, socialism, democracy, you name it. But he very rarely acknowledges the fact that there are very clear forms of ressentiment that can emerge in the ruling classes. And sometimes those are just as transparent, and they are certainly more vulgar and efficacious than the kinds of ressentiment that can animate the lower orders. And I think you see enormous numbers of examples of that today. One that became very clear to me recently was when Joe Biden decided to cancel student debt. And I saw a number of conservatives on Twitter moaning about how expensive it was. But the primary thing that they said about it was
it's not fair to the people who already paid it off.
Exactly. Or even if I had to pay for this, then they have to pay for it also, right? How else do you conceive of that? But as a kind of ressentiment of the wealthy looking downwards, right? Or, if I can't have my wealth, then what I'm going to do is flee the country, right? Or commit myself to an authoritarian regime that's going to fundamentally change it because I won't see it in the hands of the lower orders, right? All kinds of ressentiment-driven politics that have emerged in neoliberal society on the part of the ruling classes. And I think that Brown really productively demonstrates why it is that looking through Nietzsche's psychological theories and applying them in this context can be extremely helpful for the left, albeit if we read him, as Dan would say, like a parasite.
Well, let me say something about that, because I have a section on ressentiment and I slightly push against so I call it the resentment complex. And what I argue is that if you follow Nietzsche to the letter, okay, and you use it as a polemical label, and you sort of wield it to describe a community or an individual, that can actually have a lot of psychological, analytical, critical benefits. But practically, often what happens is you shut down solidarity. Mm. So I've seen many left Nietzscheans and many Nietzscheans on the right sort of wield like a hammer, philosophize like a hammer, right? This notion of ressentiment to a supposed group. And we know what that looks like on the right, like the Black welfare queen, these kind of racist cliches, etc., right? But actually what they're doing is they're sort of making a kind of ontological determination on that group, that they're kind of unchangeable. And that's a kind of quasi-theological condition, okay? Now, I think for socialist politics, we need to rethink how we wield the label of ressentiment. I'm going to be much more careful. That's why I actually think that when Nietzsche uses that term, he uses it. Remember, Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra puts overcoming revenge as the objective of what it means to ascend to the higher man. to overcome revenge. And then he furthermore says that how rare it will be for any of you who aspire to follow Zarathustra, it will be extremely rare to overcome revenge. So you see, you have a problem of a type of elitist philosophy in the notion of ressentiment, which needs to be very carefully worked with. So what I would say is that we lean more on things like psychoanalysis. Okay. We lean more on like Erich Fromm. We lean more on like Marcuse, right? Other sources to help us think political resentments, not ressentiment, because ressentiment is almost, for me, it's like it's an unchangeable condition. And there's nothing worse in politics than putting somebody in an unchangeable box. You know, that's the argument that I make. Now, you guys can read it and see if you agree with what I think. I think it actually sometimes has a problem become Schmittian. Okay, friend-enemy distinction, which I don't think politics should be like that. Okay. I think we need more sober, clear class analysis in these regards. And a lot of this stuff is fictional. When we accuse a group to be of ressentiment, I don't really know what that means. Resentments are real. Resentments are a part of political life. But when you declare somebody of ressentiment, there's a great philosopher who writes about ressentiment, and he says the use of ressentiment in his studies of it have actually not gone to change the political conditions. Usually, it's a concept to reinforce the status quo arrangement. So I think if we want to get serious about solidarity, right, we should be careful with the use of the concept. That's all I'll say. Okay?
Well, I wonder about that, because like I think that it seems like part of the difference, right, between, because it's like not anything that's sort of feeling negatively towards people who have something. I mean, my God, if we're going to do war and conquest, presumably there's a lot of negative feelings about people who have stuff that you're then going to take that are going to be involved in that, right? But it's that it's the sort of it's kind of the detachment of the resenting people for having things from the actually trying to do something about it that's going to benefit you, right? Like it's not that you just want to
exactly
you just want to like you don't want to do I mean, like this is this is all connected to Christianity, right? And like and how he sees that, right? That this is sort of you're kind of, or for that matter, you mentioned genealogy of morals earlier, the thing in the second essay, where he's talking about punishment, and he's he says he does some free will denial in passing, which actually I also think maybe bigger argument is a bad thing that a lot of leftists agree with Nietzsche about and actually shouldn't. But then he, I think you should see people as autonomous people who are capable. Anyway, whatever. But they have he says, oh, well, if punishment, is ultimately, you're like it's that you just want to inflict pain, for its own sake, right? That's what you're doing. So it's not that, you're actually getting something from it, right? Like it's just that, you feel this resentment and you just want the other person to hurt. So, I mean, like, it does seem like, look, I don't know that we need to use, French terms with schmancy lineage, philosophical lineage, just to say it, for practical political context. But I mean, I do wonder if there is something to Matt's point about like the student loans and all that like, that's like, look, somehow the thing that makes the ressentiment label feel like it fits here is that it's not like, hey, I'm not benefiting from this, so also do this thing that would benefit me, right? It's, I'm not benefiting from this, so like, fuck it, right? Like nobody should benefit if I'm
like Wendy Brown, in her analysis of the kind of disenfranchised elements of like former industrial belt, so-called white working class in America, she sort of says this is the first example of ressentiment over loss of privilege, because she does recognize that oftentimes ressentiment comes from those who never had privilege. So she says it qualifies a new form. And I thought to myself, like, that's a sort of a strange argument, right? Because it's been many decades now of deindustrialization and kind of immiseration and kind of blighted conditions for that class of people. And if I don't feel comfortable to sort of wield the label of ressentiment to adequately encompass that cohort, and it's not even clear that she refers to them as a class, by the way. So again, I just am saying, let's use caution, okay? Because you can also reify a certain liberal understanding, okay, of how a certain group functions, when actually politically they don't maybe really function that way, right?
Yeah, I
think
agree that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I agree that that's a limitation to her analysis. Although I want to make clear that I think that there's a pronounced feminist dimension to this that I think is important, right? When considering why it is that it's white men in particular who might be primarily motivated by ressentiment directed, for instance, against the emancipation of women, even if it doesn't necessarily directly impact them, or even if they might benefit, for instance, because their wife is now bringing home a little bit more money than she used to, right? Just think about all the jokes about how many men are upset when they find out that their wife is earning more money than them. But I think to Ben's point about a kind of more transparent understanding of what ressentiment means, I think that resentment can often be conflated with envy, right? And one of the things that Nietzsche stresses, or certainly other Nietzscheans have stressed, is that envy is different than ressentiment in that it can be enormously productive in some sense, right? Like if I find out that Ben is going on a vacation to Hawaii because he wrote more articles than I did, I might resent him, the fact that he's on vacation, and I might envy the fact that I want to be on vacation also. But, that might actually inspire me to sit there and be like, I've already produced 2 articles this week. Maybe I'll pump out a third, make an extra $100 or whatever. Do that for a couple of weeks, and I will be in Hawaii, and I'll have way better time than he ever possibly could.
Cheap are these tickets to Hawaii?
Yeah, no. Well,
fine. I'm sorry. I'm very confused by this example, but
we'll go to Portland instead, right? And hang out with all the hipsters and a couple of nice bars. The difference is, of course, that ressentiment, right? And primarily a kind of is primarily turned inward by the fact that we are not able to productively resolve the kind of animosities that led to these feelings in the first place. And so instead we sublimate our desire for revenge in a wide array of different and very particular and very toxic kind of ways. And I think that you can see very clear manifestations of this in many of the ruling elites in this country, precisely when they feel that something is being taken away from them by the enfranchisement of the lower orders, and they can't exactly articulate in a material sense why it's bad for the lower orders to be actually, emancipated. They just don't like it because something is being slipping away. Probably the most dramatic example of this that I can think of was actually George Wallace in Alabama in the 1960s, when, after a long period of dilly-dallying, the Johnson administration finally said, no, you are going to desegregate, and that's the end of this. He actually said, fine, if we're going to have desegregated schools, if we have to have desegregated schools, then I tell you that we're going to have no school at all. Everybody is just going to have no public schooling. That very much looks like a kind of self-punishment of the sort that Ben was talking about, where you have somebody who belongs to the ruling elite, essentially saying that I will not share space with these inferiors. And if I have to actually cause damage to our children in order to prevent them from sharing space with our inferiors, then so be it, right? Better that than a fundamental transformation in the status of the different racial groups within Alabama, right? Now, he didn't eventually go through with this, and thank God, because it would have been a horrible thing, right? But I think that's a very clear instance of ressentiment, this kind of attitude of, if I can't have what I want, then nobody will have what I want.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem I have here is that as like thinkers, right? We're sort of making a kind of ethical judgment when we wield the label, and one of its implications is that really that cohort cannot have remediation through economic egalitarianism, or that economic egalitarianism might not change their condition adequately. I think that's like exactly what Nietzsche's position is on this, right? Which is part of the reason why in my section on Nietzsche and socialism, I say one of Nietzsche's primary tactics to silence and combat socialism and Marxism, or the class struggle, let's say, was Nietzsche understood the importance of imposing austerity on workers, right? And so in a sense, the men of what Nietzsche calls the men of ressentiment are kind of ever appearing trans-historical instantiation in any social order, and they need to be pacified, right? So the Nietzschean philosopher will therefore almost tend to, not always, see the world kind of like that. And that to me, again, just throwing caution out there, okay? I just think that like maybe there's other tools we can use to get at political resentments and rethink how political resentments ought to work. I'm not claiming I have it figured out. Just read a lot about Nietzsche, and I'm a little cautious here.
Yeah. So I also think, just because I don't want to let too far go by since this was said, like I do get real itchy about talking about loss of privilege when the people who are being talked about are who were never actually all that privileged, right? Even if sure, lots of men, white or otherwise, have had unenlightened views about feminism, etc. Certainly wouldn't deny that, but I don't. I mean, you mentioned deindustrialization earlier, right? It's like having a society where you could have a job. In fact, oftentimes, if we're talking about industry and then its absence, an extremely unpleasant job, that you didn't have to climb some sort of professional ladder to get, and that and that would support you and your family, right? I mean, isn't a privilege, right? I mean, privilege implies this like extra thing beyond what everybody should have, right? Like that's just a thing that everybody should have, right? That and I don't even like look, I don't want there to be any sort of gender-based pressure for anybody to stay home if they don't want to, but but I think a decent society would actually make it possible for people who do want to stay home, raise children, etc. to do so, right? That it's very. I think you got to resist the temptation to sort of slide into this kind of neoliberal framing that this is like people actually had it too easy in the past, because surely
that's exactly how Nietzsche's anti-egalitarianism creeps into the left, you see, because the conclusion to be drawn there is, again, that economic egalitarianism will not cure their condition. And I actually think that, well, actually it will actually like it will make a substantial difference, like, right? Sure. So this is Nietzsche on the inside of the left. This is another reason why I just want to be clear with people who think that I'm too hard on him. Okay. Mm-hmm. Look, we're bringing him in a way where he wanted us to bring him in as leftists. Okay. And we're putting his stuff to work, like in a productive way. He's an antagonist, but we're not saying like, yeah, let's forget him. See you later. No, it's like he's opening up a real problem for us. And Marx doesn't really open up this problem. Only Nietzsche really opens up the problem of ultimately of suffering, right? Marx talks kind of a little bit about suffering in like 1844, but then it kind of goes away in Capital, right?
Yeah.
But Nietzsche is the very center.
I would say his characterization of religion as the heart of a heartless world intimates a kind of Nietzschean insight, but you're absolutely right that he doesn't systematize that in any kind of way. It's just kind of dangling there for you to think about.
Talks a lot in Capital about examples of suffering, but yes, he doesn't theorize about suffering as such.
But he doesn't systematically give a kind of.
Yeah. No, that's certainly true. I
just want to say one thing, actually. This is about the kind of impossibility of an authentically Nietzschean politics, right? And it's something that I really want to stress, right? I think one of the reasons why it's almost impossible to have a sincere kind of Nietzschean politics of the sort that Nietzsche himself would admire is the fact that we're fundamentally in an era of mass politics where it's very difficult to think of how any kind of aristocracy of the sort that he endorsed could take power without some kind of mass support. Now, there are still some people who will try to agitate for this on the political right. Somebody like BAP, for example, occasionally will suggest that he's a super fascist was the term, right? In the sense that he doesn't like the kind of demotic quality that fascism ended up endorsing. Or Evola, right? It was exactly the same thing when he described himself as a kind of super fascist, right? Fascism was just too left wing for him because it had too much of a role for the masses to play. But what I think all these kind of theorists miss is the fact that, well, it's very hard to convince large numbers of people to fight on behalf of an aristocratic society unless they think that they're going to be aristocrats of some sort, right? Or at the very least, unless they think they're going to benefit from it in some way, shape, or form. And I want to stress, the more far-sighted and strategic right-wing thinkers have been very good at taking Nietzschean sounding projects and extending them in what sound or seem like democratic directions. Now, fascism is one example of this that, again, Nietzsche would be critical of, but there's a reason for that, for why they did that. But you don't even have to look that far, right? W.E. Du Bois does a fantastic job of talking about the many ways in which planters in the American South tried to convince the white working class that they should be invested in the retention of the slave system. Because Du Bois points out, I think very rightly, that, look, if you were a poor working class white in the American South, you had every reason to think that you probably had more material in common with the slave than you did with the slave owners who owned thousands of acres of land and never lifted a finger to do anything for it, right? And some of the slave owners were aware of this, particularly when they were put under pressure by the North to enact abolitionism. And what you see is the emergence of an enormous number of pamphlets by Southern intellectuals arguing that actually, no, the white man in the South, especially the white working class man, is elevated by slavery, because even if his material conditions don't change, to be white is a title of nobility, as was often called in the American South. Or as another pamphleteer put it, yeah, you might not be the master, but if you're a white working class man, you get to sit at the master's table. He will call you sir. He will address you by your name, and these are things that the slaves don't have. And in each of these instances, what we see is an attempt to kind of devolve an aristocratic mentality downward without any kind of material transformation in the fundamental relations of society and the way that it reproduces itself. So those, I think, are the more dangerous kind of figures who might operate in a Nietzschean vein today and then.
So I think I agree with most of what you're saying. I mean, I will say, though, when you started out by saying we're in an era of mass politics, I mean, part of the I mean, look, some of the stuff that Daniel's talking about at the beginning of the book, the Society of Particularities is about, I think, ways in which we're not in an era of mass politics, right?
Sure. That's right.
We're in a, I mean, I guess some of this depends on how finely you cut up eras, but I mean, they have but the sort of, if you're characterizing what's going on in American culture in 2024, there's actually remarkably little mass politics going on, that in ways that maybe mean on the plus side that, classical fascism is very unlikely, but on the minus side, that anything that's liberatory and, good is also harder to get going, right? Because just actual literally getting large numbers of people, to do political things, out in the, the world is harder for any number of reasons right now. And
sure. I can accept that. I'll phrase this as, it's very hard in the modern era to achieve anything without at least pretending to a populist base for one's politics, suggesting that all we really need are the handful of aristocrats who can fundamentally change the political system without any support from those that are ultimately going to rule, right? Although I'd agree that if you characterize mass politics in terms of the formation of broad movements with wide popular support that are generally going to be insurrectionary in some way, shape, or form, that would be an inappropriate term. So
yeah, I mean, it's also, I mean, just, I don't know, people having, I mean, classical, even classical fascism, it's obviously the bad version, but I mean, you're talking about people, spending a lot of times at meeting halls and, youth movements, going hiking together and, things like that, that are, just very, contemporary reactionary politics doesn't really have an equivalent. And part of the problem is that we mostly don't either, right? There have been sparks of a revival of labor movement and et cetera, but it's all super rudimentary and overall trend lines are bad. But I did just want to shout out that part of the book, because I mean that felt very insightful to me, that I think that the kind of way that everybody's, supposed to be cultivating, their personal brand, and and kind of pursuing individual excellence. There's whatever the causation is, there's certainly something that rhymes with Nietzschean themes, even the kind of Nietzschean themes that are emphasized by people who read Nietzsche in a relatively apolitical way, right? Is just sort of about affirmation.
Well, I mean, it's a particular argument that Nietzsche is like our uber contemporary, and it's by Peter Sloterdijk, one of the people that makes this argument, where he says that Nietzsche is the godfather of our age, what he calls the age of narcissism, in which the kind of Socratic maxim of like a self-examined life, or kind of like this kind of the calling of our world can kind of be understood in a pop Nietzschean way as realizing your highest self, as determined on the market, of course, right? The market is the kind of arbiter of that realization. And this is what Andreas Rekovits, the great sociologist, has documented in his notion of the society of singularities. And that is kind of a society of an anti-politics, of an anti-mass politics. It has populism, but that populism is perceived as kind of outlaw or as subversive or ephemeral. But it's not a kind of sunk feature of the political order, right? So in that sense, left Nietzscheans maybe don't like that argument, but I think that it is kind of true in a certain way, that Nietzsche is kind of a victor, in a sense that this is kind of close to a society that might resemble something close. Because I actually do slightly disagree that Nietzsche wanted an old-fashioned aristocracy. He wanted rather an aristocracy of the future that would allow for the stabilization of a plebeian class and for their resentments and their intermixing in culture, in the process of culture making, to not happen, right? So he wanted the stratification of class hierarchies for the purpose of the cultivation of higher culture. Now you can then ask, would Nietzsche sort of agree with the sort of direction of our culture today? And he probably wouldn't. That's a whole other debate.
Yeah.
But I think on the other points, it's a valid kind of framework that Sloterdijk gives us.
Well,
Yeah.
I think this is actually, sorry, I think this is actually why it's so important to situate Nietzsche in the broader trajectory of the intellectual right. So there was a very good book that came out recently by William Banks called The Great Debate, which talks about Jorge Brandes' interpretation of Nietzsche as an aristocratic radical, and actually his long-standing debate with an early social democrat in Denmark over the legacy of Nietzsche, because he was not well received by early social democrats in Denmark. But one of the interesting things that Brandes stresses, and I want to point out that Brandes was one of the few people who actually corresponded with Nietzsche before his descent into madness. And Nietzsche actually proved this characterization of his philosophy as a kind of aristocratic radicalism, saying, it was a very clever thing to say about his philosophy. But what's central to it is precisely what Daniel was saying, that the old aristocracy, the old elite, is just not up to the task of confronting the left successfully. Because if it was, socialism, liberalism, and democracy wouldn't be creeping in everywhere around Europe. What's required is precisely the elevation of a new kind of aristocracy that is going to be much more clear-eyed about what is required in order to establish a great society, and also much more willing to be ruthless in some respects in order to put the masses back where they belong. Now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that the kind of rhetoric that surrounds Trumpism right now is inspired by Nietzsche, right? Or that, Trump is flipping through, Thus Spoke Zarathustra in his spare time, right? Rather than Hustler or whatever it happens to be, right? But there is a kind of genealogy that you can draw from this emphasis on aristocratic radicalism and the need for a new elite, and the kind of calls right now to transform the Republican Party. Because the old elite, as many on the radical right have put it, consist of rhinos or conservatives in name only, who are just incapable of putting a stop to the spread of the kind of libertine left, as many of these people understand it. And so this is why you need somebody like Donald Trump, an outsider who's still in, to come to the fore and establish a new kind of elite within the conservative movement, one that will be successful or is capable.
Isn't that best understood through Marx's notion of Bonapartism?
I think so.
I think it is.
Well, if you think so, or even if you find that idea intriguing, I do have a book for you. That thought is explored in how to read like a Parasite by Daniel Tutt, and we could easily keep this going for 3 hours because it has been a lot of fun. I guess my last substantive thing is I gave my earlier negotiating position for the Nietzscheans. I'll give another one, go back to the table and make one last attempt at bargaining, and say that maybe we can create a society where everybody's material needs are met and everybody has lots of free time, and then God knows who could be a super bad artist aristocrat under those circumstances. Something to think about. But in any case, there is a link to where you can buy your very own copy of that book in the description for the episode. Daniel, just really briefly before we let go, I know you're working on something new. What are you working on?
Oh, I'm working on a book on Lukács, actually.
Sweet.
Working on a book on Lukács, working on another book project on the psychoanalysis and class theory. Yeah. But right now we're in terms of writing. But I do a podcast called Emancipations. If anybody wants to check it out. Matt's been on. Ben will have to have you on as well. But I do like absolutely. a lot of work on Marxist theory, a lot of work on psychoanalytic theory. I do interviews on what I call new directions in Nietzschean studies. So just doing a lot of stuff on Nietzsche as well. I have some articles coming out on Nietzsche. I think there's going to be some debates that I'll be having revolving around ideas in my book. Because again, I don't call Nietzsche a proto-fascist. I call him more like a Bonapartist liberal. And that really gets under the skins of the left Nietzscheans. God bless them. So they're coming at me with their knives sharp, and I'm ready for it. I think I am.
Nice.
We'll see.
Nice. Ready for a knife fight. There we go.
I just want to say the one thing that Nietzsche was 100% right about was he pointed out that generations later people would fight wars in his name, and he was absolutely right about that. From maybe physical wars, but definitely to the online wars that are fought in his name.
I didn't mean knives, but you know what I meant. Metaphorical.
Yeah. I got you. You're not.
It's comradely. It's comradely.
Yeah.
Comradely stab in the back.
A very civilized comradely knife fight. So, point is that you're ready for it, and that is what we like to hear. Right now, pretty late because the conversation was so much fun. We're going to go to the post game for patrons. We're going to be joined by Deep State Cuba, watching the Lobster Man Jordan Peterson answer some questions from Oxford students. A little put in now that we've eaten our meat. So looking forward to that. I will see you then. If you're a patron, if you're not, I question your life choices, and you really need to consider getting it together to do that. But in any case, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you so much, Daniel.
Peace.
Thanks a lot. See you guys.